Welcome back. Certainly been a busy week in politics between South Africa and the United States. The U.S. alleging human rights violations, claims that the South African government, of course, has strongly denied. In response to U.S. President Donald Trump's executive order freezing financial aid to this country, the South African government says this lacks factual accuracy. It follows, of course, South Africa's new land reform laws, as well as its case at the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of genocide. Let's continue taking stock of the implications, or perhaps take in how we got here. Bring in now sociologist Dr Khwezi Mabasa, who's with us via our video link. Dr. Mabasa, great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. You know, I was saying just before the break that so many other issues have come to the fore insofar as the back and forth in the last 48 hours. Yes, what seems to have led the discourse or the debate has been land reform concerns, but the ICJ case has also been cited and so many other things. The question, I suppose, then, for you as a sociologist is, to what extent do you reckon all of this actually comes down to what people call the rise of the right, and South Africa just becoming a victim in all of that?
Morning, Ayanda, and morning to the viewers as well. Well, for me, I think we do have the rise of the right across the world, or increased nationalism. And one of its primary manifestations is an emphasis on prioritizing national interest at all costs. And in our case, we can see it can have implications now for our socioeconomic development in the country, especially if one looks at the areas of both aid, but also trade as well. So there's a link, there's definitely a clear link there.
Calls already for other countries, frankly, to take this opportunity to start also to become a whole lot more sustainable on their own. You know, South Africa's government, for example, being told to start rethinking how they spend their money so that we don't rely on aid as much as we do. How much of that shift do you reckon will start taking place now that it seems many countries are forced to find alternatives outside of the US's help?
My sense is that that shift has been discussed even before this current moment, because there's always been a debate about, one, ensuring that South Africa and even other countries in the world, in the global south, are not overly dependent on aid, but secondly, also diversifying trade relations, especially export markets, so, in a context where there is national interest that is being prioritized currently. And I think this also presents opportunities for the country to take forward some of these discussions, which I argue existed before this moment. So debates about diversifying trade within the context of BRICS, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and other initiatives, so that one is not overly dependent on certain exports markets. And also, I think the second point that I want to raise is the relationship between aid and also policy autonomy. There's always been a debate around this issue that often aid comes with certain conditionalities that constrain the policy choices for countries who receive that aid. And I think this current moment is also reminding us about that issue, that we also need to decrease the over-dependence on aid so that we can protect the country's policy autonomy, which is important, I think, for achieving our key socioeconomic goals. I mean, there's even been research that's been done about this. One of the most prominent books is the book by Dambisa Moyo around and it's entitled Debt Aid, and it emphasizes this question around policy autonomy and aid.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But, you know, if, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has been ratified years ago, by the way, is ever going to work, or at least fill the gaps, you need strong governance systems to be in place. And perhaps that's where the conversation should have started, actually. Do countries on the African continent have strong enough governance mechanisms to be able to fend off a powerhouse like the US without their people suffering?
Well, I think the first point we have to make when it comes to governance is that one of the key agreements of implementing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is developing the capacities within state to ensure that we have smooth implementation. And I think the way we should build that is through using African regional bodies to learn from each other, develop skills transfers on the best mechanisms for improving governance for achieving that. But also, obviously, we have to also honor the agreements in the implementation stages of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And And I think there is potential to develop that. The AU has set up several institutional mechanisms, such as the African peer review mechanism, and other principles around governance in order to drive the improved state bureaucracy across the continent to realize the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Yeah.
This moment, of course, also allows us to speak a whole lot more about multilateralism and its place in a context where it seems there's a whole lot more of a nationalistic agenda at play. I mean, even just when we take stock of how conflicts in the world are dealt with, it seems there isn't any multilateral body that's able to ultimately convince the powerful countries to change their minds if, in fact, they are involved in either actively waging war or supporting one of the warring parties. My question, once again, as you wear your sociologist hat, is where you reckon multilateralism is headed in a world characterized by the likes of Trump and so many others?
Yeah, of course. I think the legitimacy of multilateral institutions has been questioned, especially when states that wield significant political power don't abide by some of the underlying principles that inform those multilateral institutions. But I don't think that we should revert back to a situation where we have no form of multilateralism at all, or we just work on pure national interests. I think there are important principles that underlie multilateralism that we still need to keep. Principles of the preservation of human rights, solidarity, economic cooperation and coordination, decreasing global economic imbalances. And if you look at most multilateral institutions, especially the ones that operate in key development areas, they are organized around those principles. So I think we need to reaffirm those principles, and where there need to be reforms, of course, we need to make the reforms so that we can sustain multilateralism over time. Because whether we like it or not, we are living in a globalized political and economic context, and you have to relate with other nations and states on the basis of certain key principles and institutional mechanisms that allow us to realize those principles.
Sure. Fascinating discussion indeed. And as the cliche goes, time will tell what happens next. Dr. Khwezi Mabasa, thanks very much indeed for giving us your insights. Dr. Mabasa speaking to us there as a sociologist as we continue taking stock of the relationship between South Africa and the US given the past 48 hours.